You're very welcome to this seminar on innovation in media policy, arranged by Institutet för Mediestudier, the Institute for Media Studies. My name is Lars Truedson, and I'm the head, let's say, I can't think of a quick translation of the Swedish title, of this NGO, as it is. And I'm very honored to have a distinguished panel with me today. And I'll just say a few introductory words and present the participants, and then we'll start one by one. So the topic is innovation in media policy, and we've had a few seminars in adjacent topics based on chapters from this book, The Snail and the Hare, How to Make Media Policy Catch Up with Media Development, to make an impromptu translation. And here are a dozen, something like that, texts, most of them proposing new ideas in media policy, some giving background and some adding some research to the topic. It's all in Swedish. The seminar will be in English, so we can have Professor Victor Pickard of the University of Pennsylvania, who is professor of media policy, very fittingly, and political economy as well. Very welcome, Professor Pickard. And I also welcome Ragnhild Olsen of Oslo Met University, where you are an associate professor. Would that be a reasonable translation? Förstaamanuens, is that something like that? And you'll both present your chapters in a moment, as will Carl-Gustaf Lindén, also now in Norway, Bergen University, but you are, your roots are in Finland. Your Swedish roots are in Finland.
Exactly. So I'm a Swedish-speaking Finn.
Swedish-speaking Finn, speaking English. And you're also an associate professor in media studies. So I'm honored to have you with us, and also Raoul Grünthal, media industry executive for a decade or more with Schibsted, the Norwegian Scandinavian giant, media industry giant. Amongst other positions, you were the CEO of Schibsted Sweden for several years, as well as for Svenska Dagbladet, and earlier for the news agency TT, Swedish news agency. Very glad to have you with us. You left Schibsted just a few weeks ago.
That's correct.
Yeah, so perfect. Finally, you can speak freely and tell us what you really think. Okay, you're all very welcome. And Mr. Pickard, you want to create a whole new form of media ownership in your chapter. That's your proposition. What are you proposing and why?
Thank you for that question. Thank you all also for just being here and organizing this panel, and also for accommodating me by speaking English. I do appreciate that. I'm sorry that that's the language I have to always speak in. But I would gladly answer that question in about 5 minutes or so, just sort of an overview of what I'm proposing here. And if I remember correctly, we were explicitly told when we were writing these pieces that we didn't have to worry about history, or we didn't have to worry about, you know, what had already happened. Yes, and I mean, as a historian, that was sort of an odd thing to do, but yet I found that very liberating, and I took that as a license to think in a very utopian manner, to really imagine, you know, if we were to design a media system from scratch, what might that look like? And I guess I was cheating a little bit because I was still drawing from historical memory and basing this on the assumption that we now know from our current vantage point that certain things don't work as well as we might hope. And more specifically, I think pegging our news and information directly to the commercial market is something that we have learned does not always pan out in the way that we might hope, that in a way that serves democratic society. So I guess I was cheating a bit by drawing from these historical lessons, but I wanted to think in terms of if we could create something new, and especially around this current local journalism crisis that most countries around the world are grappling with at the moment. What might we do? And I'm proposing what I'm calling a public media center, the PMC. And I'll return to that in just a moment, but I want to provide a little bit of context for how I get there. And I start with this premise that the information that journalism produces is a public good. It's non-excludable, non-rivalrous. We can quibble over certain details, but generally we can assume that the market will not provide the news and information in sufficient quantity and quality. And many societies around the world have recognized this by supporting a robust public media center. The US is a little bit different. We're literally off the chart for how little we actually allocate towards our public media center. But I think that there is this recognition of what I think of as systemic market failure, so that we have to publicly fund certain kinds of news and information. Now, for many years, there was this kind of almost false perception that the market could produce a lot of the news and information that we need. It was highly profitable, especially when it was dependent on advertising revenue. But of course, now that model has really come apart. And again, this is very acute when we look at local journalism. And this also underscores this idea that not only are we talking about a public good, we really should think of it as a merit good. So it's not just based on public wants necessarily, but it's based on this idea of information needs, of critical information needs that individuals typically are unable or unwilling to support financially sufficiently. So again, I'm always coming back to this idea of public funding. We need to have more public funding for news and information. I should have said up front that this does draw from the conclusion of my most recent book, where I will have some more details, but I'm still trying to put more flesh on these bones. And this is where writing this piece was very helpful for me, because I started thinking more concretely, what would a public media center look like? I'm arguing that it should be federally guaranteed. And in the US, I'm calling for somewhere between a budget of $30 to $35 billion, which sounds like a lot, yet we're currently talking about like a $4 trillion infrastructure bill. So it's all relative, right? It's actually not as much as it might first sound.
It's just 10 times the Swedish national defense.
Right. Well, there's a lot that could be said about that. Our defense budget.
Let's not go there.
Yeah, if we just took a small fraction of our defense budget, we would be able to support a massive public media system. So I do think the money is there. I have a plan B if we don't take it directly from the Treasury that I can get into later. But basically, these public media centers should be locally governed, democratically controlled by the communities that they serve. The journalists should come from those communities. The newsrooms should look like the communities that they serve. These public media centers should be multimedia hubs. We can put them in public spaces such as libraries, schools, public broadcasting stations, post offices. So in many ways, I'm calling for leveraging already existing public infrastructures and expanding them and repurposing them. So I'm just about out of time, but I want to note that I imagine this public media center being an informational feeder for the entire media system. It doesn't necessarily phase out the commercial sector. And indeed, in many ways, it provides a subsidy for the commercial sector that can draw from the information being produced by these local news hubs. And the final thing I'll say is that we do have a few real world examples that I can point to. So it's not entirely utopian. It's what Eric Olin Wright would call a real utopia, an actually existing utopia. But again, I'm calling for really scaling it up. And I'll end on that utopian note. Thank you.
Thank you so much. May I just put one quick question for one quick answer? Where do you see this in relation to a public service system? Is it
Yes.
local public service? What is it?
Right, yeah, so I imagine building on, now it's an open question whether we need to scrap and create something entirely new, if we should jettison the currently existing public broadcasting system. But my first instinct would be to try to build upon it and restructure it. So I see that as the grain, as the seed upon which we can grow this system. But also, and I know one of your follow-up questions was, how does this impact, for example, Nordic countries that already have these very well-funded public media systems, but in many countries, those systems don't focus on local journalism for different reasons. And so even there, I think some of these lessons, even though I'm focused more in the US context, I think some of this is applicable to these other countries that do already have strong PS, public service broadcasting systems.
Thank you very much. I'm very eager to hear from Raoul Grünthal, for instance, about this, who has really done business in the media industry in a public service-based rich country. But now, Ragnhild Christine Olsen, I'd like you to elaborate a bit about the suggestions that you present in your chapter in this book.
Thank you very much. It's a great opportunity to exchange ideas and perhaps also think a little bit aloud about how media policy can be formulated in the future or for the future. And I would like to start with the question that lies at the heart of my contribution to this very interesting and timely book. And that is, do news media and journalism, and the journalism that news media offer, do that really create value for society if it's not used? And by posing this question and suggesting that the answer to that is no, journalism creates little social value if it isn't used by the public, I'm suggesting a somewhat different theoretical framing of the media policy debate, and I discuss some implications for media subsidies. And I would like to underline that I do so from a media welfare state perspective, where state subsidies are already in place. They're well established to support the provision of journalism in society. But I argue that journalism is a service that news media offers to individuals and to society, and that the real value of that service is co-created by news media and their audiences. So journalism in and of itself is only a value proposition to the audience. It becomes valuable when it is being used and experienced as valuable by the audience. So like a car that doesn't really have much value until it's put in use by the driver, journalism doesn't really have much value until it is consumed and contributes to making the audience smarter, more informed, and better equipped to make good decisions for themselves and for the collective. And these ideas are inspired by a specific subfield of economic theory, which is called service dominant logic, which applied to the media policy discourse challenges the view that media policy should be concerned with securing the provision of journalism alone. Instead, it encourages us to think about how media policy could be shaped to stimulate value co-creation between news media and their audiences. Specifically, how to encourage audiences to invest and engage in journalism in a media landscape that is characterized by an abundance of free content and where news media are continuously competing for audiences' attention. Based on this, I posit that media policy should address problems for people's engagement with news, i.e. obstacles to value co-creation. And I would like to highlight two such problems: the problem of payment and the problem of relevance. The payment problem concerns the implementation of so-called online paywalls and the shift from an advertising-based to a user payment-based business model in commercial news media. Both the cost of subscriptions and the availability of free content online give some cause for concern over disengagement with journalism, particularly in some parts of the population, younger audiences, for instance. The problem of relevance concerns audiences' rapidly changing needs and expectations and news media's ability to understand and meet these requirements. Tech platforms such as Facebook and Google have established new standards for relevance and personalization of content, specialized in building loyalty and increasing use of their services. And continuously improving the relevance of the journalistic offering is a huge challenge for news media. It requires investment in tech and service innovation, which many smaller news operations is just not capable of. So how can media policy address these problems? Regarding the problem of payment, I argue for the introduction of media subsidies on the individual media user level. This could include free newspaper subscriptions or tax deduction for newspaper subscriptions. A more radical idea is subsidized gamification of news consumption, whereby media users are rewarded with information points for reading journalistic content. And these points could be invested in other goods and services. There are privacy issues with this suggestion, the data protection issues related to such arrangement, and it may be a bad idea, even a terrible idea, to involve the state in this kind of reward scheme. But it may be something the industry itself should investigate, particularly when trying to attract younger audiences, and particularly on the local level, I think. This brings us to the second problem of relevance and the need to continuously innovate the value proposition to audiences and to improve relevance. This is something the news media must primarily address themselves. But state innovation support serves as an important incentive for such innovation. And such subsidies are already in place in Norway as well as Sweden and in other countries, but they could become more targeted to specifically help news media in developing superior audience experiences and improve relevance. So to sum up, based on the premise of value co-creation, I suggest media subsidies that focus on the use of journalism as a prerequisite for a well-functioning democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One question that came to mind when I read your chapter was, doesn't journalism have an intrinsic value? Just the thought that you keep power in fear. Just by existing, the local reporter keeps power in fear. Do you need to make this assumption of the, does it even have to be read by large numbers? Isn't it enough that the reporting is there? How do you reflect on this?
I think that it's even intrinsic. I think it's Robert Picard who argues on the intrinsic value of journalism, or the intrinsic value of news and communication products, and argues that it has to have some, it needs to be experienced as valuable for somebody in order to have value. But of course, having a system of investigative journalists, investigative media institutions that keeps track on power and serves as a watchdog in society has a value in itself. But it is, I would argue that it is when that watchdog role is being appreciated by an audience, when it has an impact on the audience, makes the audience better informed, that's when the real value emerges.
That sounds very reasonable, I agree. Carl-Gustaf Lindén, your contribution is headlined "The Death of National Media Policy." That sounds interesting. Explain it to me.
Yes, thank you for having me in the conference. A really good company here. I mean, I've been looking at from the perspective of platformization, going to the perspective of deplatformization. And I have two colleagues here in the audience, Mikko and Katja, who are working on the same project on deplatformization of media and journalism. So this is sort of part of that the whole picture, the big picture. I mean, we know the overall challenge. I mean, how do we regulate something that, if you use the words of Silicon Valley, move with the speed of dreams? How do you regulate something that may change in terms of use monthly or even weekly? I mean, there's like amoebas. And who has the resources? These companies have the resources to find all the loopholes you can ever find in regulations. I mean, how do you actually manage to regulate these companies? Certainly not by using national media policy. And we're, of course, talking about Google, Apple, Amazon Web Services, Facebook, and the Chinese counterparts. and they have changed the operating sort of logics of media and journalism in sort of in structure. And this certainly, these companies have sort of captured the news media industry through technology, through business models, through innovation, through metaphors, through sort of copying best practices from Silicon Valley. And we have a situation where the freedom of expression has increasingly been taken over by private companies such as Facebook. And these are companies that purely for commercial purposes say they believe in the, from my perspective, problematic metaphor, the market for ideas, market-based ideas. And as some call it, the free speech fundamentalism. And the short answer to this question is no. I don't think you can regulate these platforms by applying national media policy. And in that sense, national media policy is dead. And of course, the long answer is certainly extremely complex and so difficult. Includes, a supernatural sort of collaboration, new institutions. I don't think the WTO or UN is sufficient to sort of regulate these companies. We need something else. And I want to add some more complexity to this issue. The platforms are on the way of becoming captured themselves. Even though Mark Zuckerberg has full control of Facebook, in theory, we see what's going on, and if you can ask, does he even know what's going on there? And can Facebook actually be sort of controlled by one person, or is it captured by bad actors? And does it matter then that Facebook has signed the EU's code of practice on disinformation? It seems to me that his company is struggling with forces that are beyond his control. But again, and maybe come back now to what Ragnhild and Victor said, national media policy is not totally out of the picture. We all believe in our region, I think, somewhat in the Nordic media welfare state, and sort of the idea that the media and journalism is connected to the welfare of society. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when discussing the limitations and possibilities of national media policy. And then we have sort of a theoretical concept in the Nordic media welfare state model, but we've never been able to operationalize this one. What does it actually mean? What are sort of the policy components of this model? We discuss it from a theoretical perspective. It might be for me, Victor, that this is sort of the utopia of the media world. Where you have very strong public service, you have subsidies for news media, and really sort of a appreciation of journalism and the trust in journalism. In Finland, it's the highest in the world, and Norway doesn't come far behind. So that they have a sort of a capital to build on. And I think one of the strengths of the Nordic media welfare state model is this combination of strong public service and commercial companies. And the state's role is at arm's length. It's not intervening very much in what's going on. It's just sort of trying to make sure that the playing field is level. And that's where, again, the regulation of platforms comes in. You don't have a level playing field in the Nordic states. Lots of money is not just siphoning out, but floating out from the advertising through Holland to the Cayman Islands and so forth. So that's something which you can't sort of solve on the national level. You have to have the EU or maybe the global level for that.
Does the EU, is the EU a player big enough to make some contribution to this regulation, do you think?
I do think so, yeah. I think EU is the most important player at the moment, because the US Congress has not been able, I don't think the Democrats will be able to regulate Silicon Valley because they're too dependent. Look at Obama came to power through support from Silicon Valley, through support from Facebook and so forth. They turned around, the tide turned around, and Trump did the same. Not getting the support from Silicon Valley, but support from Facebook and sort of social media, then suddenly was evil. But I don't think, looking at the administration, there's some exceptions, will not be able to sort of tackle Silicon Valley. I don't think so, even though the speaking about this sounds good, but when it comes to actual regulation, I think you won't see it. It goes against, I think, also the US talked about of freedom of expression and I think the marketplace of ideas is really strong in the US.
Yes. I'm looking forward to hearing Victor's views on this. But first, thank you. First, thank you, Gussa, as I know you're usually addressed, and Raoul. Has anything of what you just heard and read, if you've had the chance to browse the book, would anything of this be helpful for a Swedish media company such as Schibsted or Bonnier or Amedia?
Yes, first of all, I think thank you for a great book, because what is very helpful is that intelligent people try to dig into this question. And of course, there are no easy, obvious or easy solutions, but at least with this book, many people have made a try. And I think that's very important. So thank you very much. I would perhaps like to add 2 or 3 points before going into the discussion. I think that, well, first of all, I really love the book, but I also can see that it is, in its tone, it's quite pessimistic. And of course, I agree that journalism is under threat. Local players and even national players are, to a certain extent, under pressure. But we must not forget that digital media is one of the most exciting and growing industries in the world. And I think that the main problem is not that it's an industry that needs help with subsidies or needs to be replaced by the state with new kind of public services. It's an industry that needs to have a level playing field. That's really, if you just have one focus on all media policies, it's about creating a level playing field. And personally, I'm optimistic. If the media policies are able to do that, I'm quite certain that long-term we will have great journalism, we will have local, regional, national, European, Scandinavian media players who will create great stuff and will play a very important role in society by creating let's say the democratic infrastructure, but also by creating an industry which is very dynamic and good for the country. So I don't, yeah.
Are you equally optimistic about journalism as you are about the media industry? Because as Schibsted proves better than anybody else, the money is in the digitalized classifieds.
Yes, and journalism is doing well as well. But I may agree that this is perhaps a Scandinavian view. I can see that many of my colleagues in other parts of Europe, they have a different kind of situation. But if I focus on Scandinavia, yes, we have such a strong culture of journalism that I'm quite certain that if we have successful media companies, we will also have great journalism. That's at least my belief. And I think also that a little bit like Carl-Gustaf, I think that the problem when reading the book is that many of the proposals are about subsidizing or giving new roles to public service. And I don't think that's the long-term solution. I perfectly agree it may be part of the solution. It may be a short and medium good solution. But I think that there is a problem that people tend to find solutions within the scope that is national. And to create a level playing field is not something you can do on a national level. That's obvious. And so how do you create that kind of level playing field? Well, there's been lots of focus on taxes. And of course, that's important. But I think that the most important thing is to have good competition laws and have these laws implemented in the right way. And at least in Europe, I think that it is on a European level that you must do that. So that's really, I think, is the main focus. And it's not easy, but it's something that is possible to do. I'm perfectly certain of that. So that's one. And also, I mean, the problem is not that Google and Facebook are not doing great products or that they are bad or evil. It's just that if nobody stops them, they will abuse their dominant position on the market, as Standard Oil did, as many banks did in the past. That's why you need politicians to create rules. But right now, they don't follow the rules. Use Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. They create the rules, and that's the basic problem. That's number one. Number two is that when reading the book and also when listening to many of my colleagues in the media industry, I have the feeling that people are cautiously optimistic about the user payment model, but they are more or less giving up. They're more or less giving up the advertising model for journalism. I think that you shouldn't. I recognize that just now there is tough times for advertising, but I think that it's important long term to keep many business models, because a diversity in business models means also diversity in journalism and in the products. So I think that it's of course good news that people are ready to pay for journalism and for digital journalism. But if you look at it from a democratic point of view, that product will mainly be a product for well, a more narrow, well-educated target group. So I think, and if you want to reach a broader target group, you need medias that are financed by advertising, I think. And I think it's too early to give up, because I think that the problems with advertising are linked to the non-dominant position of on a few global players that, as I said before, needs to be regulated. So I think, and that's, and also if I look at the proposal for different kind of solutions, it's very often about how do we make people pay for journalism, and if they don't, how do we make the state give some money to the newspaper so they can produce journalism anyway. I mean, more or less, the advertising model has been forgotten, and I think it's not a good thing. Then, also when I look at the debate in Brussels, I have the feeling that sometimes when trying to solve the platform problem and the problem with the American and in the future Chinese giants, the politicians are more or less trying to ban all kind of targeted advertising based on personal data. I think that's totally the wrong way to go. That will be, I think, in the future, one of the main sources of income in order to produce journalism. So that's, so I think to prohibit that is the wrong way to do it. You must regulate it, but not prohibit it. Then finally, perhaps not as important, but I think that very often when you debate media policies, you start debating public service, perhaps too often, because it's a debate where people have such feelings and they are always based on what kind of political color they have. But at least I want to say that I agree that public policy, public service can be part of the solution, but you must also acknowledge that, at least in Scandinavia, it is today part of the problem. And I think that sometimes I read and also in this book that there is, as it was a truth that there is a symbiotic relation between public service and commercial media. I think that that maybe have been the truth in the past, and from, of course, in some points it's true even today, because we share the same values from independent journalism and so on. But from a commercial point of view, it's obvious that it's not the case anymore, because that kind of symbiotic relationship was based on that we made different products. Newspapers made excellent news in newspapers, commercial newspapers, and the public service made excellent news on television and on radio. And then everything merged in one media in the internet. And in news in Sweden, mainly Aftonbladet and some other commercial newspapers took that role together with the platforms. And public service was more or less left behind. So what did the public service do? Well, they made a copycat of Aftonbladet.se. And I can just not understand why the role of public service would be to make a copycat of commercial media. And it's obvious that it's more difficult to make people pay for Aftonbladet.se if SVT.se, the national TV, public service TV, make more or less the same thing as Aftonbladet. So I think that's
as long as they're advertised, financed by by ads. Not to get into pronunciation problems, by ads, they're still in different markets.
Yes, but we are selling. Yes, but we are selling eyes. We are selling readers to the advertisers, and basically what the state is doing is taking that market away from us or from them. I don't work for them anymore, but I think at least but I'm a public service friend. But I think that it's so anti-intellectual to pretend that there's no problem about this. It's obvious that it's not a symbiotic relationship anymore.
So, yeah, Victor Pickard, we had this discussion about regulating the platforms. Carl-Gustaf raised it and so saw rather little hope of a US regulation. What's your comment on this and the links it has to the survival of journalism?
Thank you. And thank you for all the comments from all the panelists. I think they're very, very stimulating. I've got a lot of ideas rolling around in my head right now. But I agree with Carl-Gustaf to his larger point, which is we do need to start thinking internationally. These are global companies, and it's going to be a losing battle if we try to fight them country by country. So there needs to be more harmonizing and coordinating between different policy regimes. I completely agree with that. I wouldn't entirely give up hope on the US front. I do think the EU is doing much more aggressive and good regulating right now compared to the US, but there actually is a rare bipartisan consensus emerging for many wrong reasons. The Republicans have some absurd arguments about Facebook having some kind of anti-conservative bias, but for whatever reason, they are coming together. The question is, what is this regulation going to look like? There's a growing push to enforce antitrust interventions, which I don't think will solve all the problems. As much as I love hearing that phrase, smash up Facebook, that sounds great. But I don't think that's certainly that's not going to solve the local journalism problem. And this, I think, gets to part of what Raoul was saying, which is, he wants this level playing field. And that's another area of regulation we saw this in Australia. There's a push here in the US where the publishers get more of the advertising revenue pie from the platforms. But that too, I'm afraid, will not solve, especially the local journalism crisis. Even before Google and Facebook started gobbling up all the advertising revenue, there was already, this advertising revenue-based model had already largely collapsed. Digital advertising pays pennies to the dollar of traditional print advertising. And I don't think simply having Facebook and Google give a little bit more money back to the publishers, I just don't think that's going to solve it. And unfortunately, reader support is also not supporting the journalism we need. So that's why I keep coming back to the public funding model. But I probably went far beyond what you were hoping for. So sorry.
It's very interesting. And don't want to leave Ragnhild and Carl-Gustaf out of this discussion, but still, Raoul, how does this pessimism about the advertisements sector supporting journalism ring with you? And also, what do you think about Victor's suggestion about public media centers?
Well, I mean, I can understand that from an American standpoint and the situation that you have in the States. But in Sweden, it would not be a solution, I think. It would be rather make the problem even worse. But where I really, this concept of advertising being part of the future or not, I think that the situation where Scandinavia is very different from not the whole rest of the world, but most of the rest of the world, is that in Sweden, large media players tend to be destinations. And in many countries, they are not anymore. So when you go look at news at aftonbladet.se, you go directly to aftonbladet.se. You don't go via a platform. And if you want to be financed by the advertising market, it's absolutely necessary to be a destination. You cannot just get traffic from others. And that, I think, has been the great mistake in many countries. I don't think that the large mistake has been that you have sold journalism for free. It's that you had given up the concept of being a destination.
Ragnhild, is the Scandinavian model just a dream to the rest of the world, or could it be applied? We have both these concepts now, that the high level of digital audience payments, and we have the destination concept that at least VG in Norway and Aftonbladet in Sweden has kept very large audiences. Can it be applied to others?
I think we should be careful coming from a Scandinavian context to assume that you can just roll out our welfare state model in any national context. It has a historical background. It has a cultural background. It has an economic foundation which you don't find everywhere else. So but I often think of myself as somebody living in an extremely fortunate media system, being in a Norwegian or a Swedish or a Danish or a Finnish context, because I think we are better off than many other countries. I think we have to appreciate that. But I do think that this model of a combined commercial media and a public media is, even though Raoul makes really valid points about the competition between the commercial media sector and the public service media sector, I think we have found, at least if we look at how it has worked in the past, it has been fairly well working, fairly functional, I think. So I think that model has something to it that that could inspire other national context, other media systems. But I'm not 100% sure that we can say, based on a situation where we have a highly digitalized population, which has high media consumption, high average income, that you can just apply a media structure and system that works in that specific context to any sort of national context. I think that would be naive, honestly.
Thank you. Carl-Gustaf, there was this discussion about banning targeted data. That sounds straight up your alley of research. How would you comment on, would you agree with Raoul of the risk of doing this to the media industry?
Yeah, well, I mean, targeted advertising is the old model, because you had all this in newspapers, you could have a whole few pages about cars or tourism or whatever, that was sort of targeted advertising with targeted journalism. I think ad-funded journalism is fundamentally different from reader-funded journalism. I think that's a distinction which has not often been made, and I think that's an important one. And I think there's a huge difference. But as Ragnhild said, I mean, being in Norway is fantastic, because we have this sort of the highest level of paying for digital news in the world. I mean, and I think our media, Schibsted, Polaris Media, and the others have really sort of found out how to sort of create value for readers. I mean, they're still not reached the goal, but they're very much on their way. But I would like to talk about another thing which Victor and Raoul also talked about. I mean, the regulation part and what the EU is doing. I mean, Australia was mentioned. I mean, and there's so much potential for unintended consequences in sort of trying to solve these problems. If you look at Australia, the one who sort of won in this race was, of course, Rupert Murdoch, which is the biggest newspaper
always is
in Australia. And he had the power, the resources to negotiate with Google and Facebook, and the others got nothing. So, I mean, the game just got sort of even worse by supporting Rupert Murdoch in this sense. So I think this is a problem. What could go wrong? I mean, like it actually did in Australia. So that's something we need to discuss much more.
So one shouldn't regulate because you can't see the consequences of it, or what's your?
Well, as I mean, we've also discussed, in many senses, social media is really good for us. I mean, for me, Google is fantastic. I mean, I'm totally dependent on Google. And we need to lift up this sort of the issue and this discussion on a much higher level of digital infrastructure. And now, talking about, for instance, cloud computing and dependency. I mean, say if Schibsted is running on Amazon Web Services, and they do the infrastructure for cloud infrastructure for the whole Schibsted is AWS. And we know what happened with Parler in the US in January. The Amazon Web Services drew the plug and Parler disappeared. I mean, they could do the same thing with Schibsted if they want to, if they decide Schibsted is becoming a problem. So, I mean, the media is really vulnerable to these sorts of threats. And that's also something which is not discussed.
Question, yeah.
I can just add, I mean, what's very clear in this discussion is that one of the difficult things is that the solutions must obviously be international, but the markets are still very national, and they are very different from country to country. So even though the solutions must be international, it's quite difficult to find solutions that work for every country. And that's why I'm so focused on creating a level playing field, because that's good for all the markets. But I agree very much with Professor Picard when he says that the solution is not to make Google and Facebook give some money to the media industry, because one, it will always be that the biggest takes most of the money. But secondly, if you do that, you accept the situation as it is today, and you must fundamentally change the situation of today. You couldn't change the situation in the oil industry by making Standard Oil pay some money to the other players. That's ridiculous. And we have the same situation today. So I think that those countries that have focused on making Google and Facebook and some other players pay some money to the local players, they have already lost. So that's not a good solution.
Professor Picard, what are your thoughts about this national, international regulation and on the differences between the Scandinavian system and the US that are in a way diametrically different?
Yes, thank you. I'll answer that second question first because it's the easy one. I wish we had that media welfare state in the US. And when I hear about your problems, I wish those were our problems. But it's all relative, and I understand that they aren't perfect systems, and there's always room to improve upon them. But as far as internationalizing, again, I totally agree. I agree with what Raoul just said, that we need to move towards these more international fora to make these decisions. We need to look at international instruments by which we can try to rein in these platform monopolies. But I think what Raoul was suggesting, and I agree with, this is the problem, which is if you regulate them, you risk locking in their power, right? So it's got to be meaningful regulations. But if we're talking about what are essentially natural, what used to be called natural monopolies, and Carl-Gustaf, this idea of infrastructure keeps coming up in our discussion. I absolutely agree with that. It's a global infrastructure. There's almost 3 billion users of Facebook now. So it's something like, I think Raoul might be, I don't know if he was suggesting that we should break them up, but this is the problem where if we're talking about this very precious infrastructure, we really should be looking at questions of ownership and control. So if we look at the broad spectrum of regulation, it needs to be towards, we're not even talking nationalizing, we're talking about international, and bringing them under some sort of global democratic control. It's not something that we've really done before. So it's going to be very challenging, but I'm not convinced that breaking them up will get us there. And but at the same time, I do think we need to regulate, we need to have data privacy protections. The surveillance advertising model is deeply problematic. So that's something we're going to have to grapple with.
Thank you. I'd like to open up for questions and comments from the audience right now, especially questions. They're usually more interesting, and or the answers can be. And there's already been one question from Professor Gunnar Nygren to Ragnhild. And it reads like this: if we want to subsidize local media use, what level is needed to make it meaningful? And is this level realistic?
I think that's a very good question. Thank you, Gunnar. I think I would like to address that by saying it depends on how ambitious we would like to be in building that sort of solution. If, for instance, as one of the suggestions that I discuss in my chapter in this book is the possibility of subsidizing a local newspaper subscription for people who are underprivileged, for instance. If we start by that and we identify that as one of the main challenges that we're working with, if we look at the number of people who are living below a certain level of income in the Nordic countries, the number of families who are below that level or are receiving some sort of social services in order to keep afloat. And if we look at the price of a subscription, I think if we look at the money spent in subsidies in direct production support today, and we put that similar amount of money into that sort of subsidies, we would come a very long way in subsidizing a new subscription for that part of the population, at least. So if we start at that level, then I think we'll get an impression of what this is going to cost. But I have been fortunate to not be forced to calculate the cost this far. But I think if we look realistically at it, we would get a long way by spending as much money on this sort of subsidies as we do currently on production support.
Yeah, thank you. That's anyone willing to comment on this one? Otherwise, I would like to ask you, Raoul, do you really want to break up the platform companies, the global platforms? Victor was sort of asking whether you thought that. Is it a standard oil solution?
It has worked in other industries, but I'm not so sure that it's the solution in this case. I mean, there are some things that are the media policies must try to do, and I think the most important one is that these global and very strong players must not be able to use a monopoly in one part of the value chain in order to destroy the market in another part of the value chain. And that has been obvious last year in the advertising market. That's exactly what they are doing. In some industries, the only way to avoid that is to break up the companies. But there may be other solutions. So you don't necessarily have to break up the companies. There may be other solutions, I think.
Thomas Bekdal, Danish media analyst, writes in this book that punishing the platforms like Google and Facebook with taxes or regulation just because they've been better at managing the digitalization of the media would be both unwise and unfair. What are your comments to that?
Yeah, I perfectly agree. It's not about punishing. It's about them making follow rules. But the problem is today that they are not only good. They are good. I think that they have some fantastic products and they are great companies. I perfectly agree. But it would be naive not to see that they are also abusing the dominant position in the market in order to make life hard for competitors. And that does not create value for the customers. That destroys value.
What's your comment, Carl-Gustaf Lindén?
Yes, I mean, if you look at Silicon Valley, and I've been sort of obsessed by Silicon Valley for the past 20 years. So I think what you need to understand is the venture capital model of Silicon Valley, which sort of premieres winners and those who can actually crush competition and create monopolies. I mean, Silicon Valley is not about open competition, it's about crushing competition. And so you have, thanks to the huge market values created by venture capital, they've had the opportunities to crush competition. I mean, we have lots of examples in the Nordic countries of companies which have been sort of trying to be quite successful. and then maybe Facebook and Google has balked their competition and made their services for free. And even though the Nordic companies provided better services, you always choose the free one, of course. So that's a sort of example how this logic of Silicon Valley, the venture capital logic, also affects the Nordic countries. And I think that's sort of, we don't think about that. And I know that
comes to mind.
Schibsted has sort of been through this as well, trying to sort of create a search engine which would be a competition for Google in 2008. It was a really expensive experiment. I think you learned a lot, but it went down with sort of in flames.
Yeah, an expensive learning.
Oh my God, yeah. Professor Picard, what's your comment on this part of the discussion?
Yeah, I do think that there are some things we could certainly do, like force Facebook to divest itself of Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger. We could try to break up some of that vertical integration. We absolutely should prevent them from acquiring any new, assets. So I certainly think that is one tool in our toolbox, and I like having the antitrust club on the table in full view of everyone at all times. I think that must be a viable weapon to use against some of these monopolies, but I keep coming back to this idea of it being a core infrastructure, and some of these problems aren't just monopoly problems, they're capitalism problems. So, if we had 3 Facebooks, we'd still have surveillance capitalism to contend with. So I do, and as far as like subsidizing the media, and this is where I agree with Ragnhild, this idea of subsidizing at the individual level. We're starting to actually do that in the U.S. We're calling for subsidizing subscriptions, and there's a more radical proposal that Bob McChesney has been pushing for years, which is having these citizen vouchers, where we all get $200 to allocate towards our media of choice. So I do think there are some creative ideas out there for doing these things. It's just we're lacking the political will.
Yeah, just like the Swedish school system, it's been hugely successful with the school vouchers. Sorry, that was an aside. Where should we take this for the last few minutes?
Lars, I could just add to Professor Picard, because I think it was the last thing that was quite interesting. I think that what we must acknowledge is that the problem is really fundamental. It's not just about saving the media industry. It's about that our whole system is based on a balance of power between different parts of society. For instance, the states and companies. And the problem with the global platforms is that they look like companies, and they are in one way companies, but they're also acting like states. As I said, they don't pay taxes, they collect taxes. They don't follow rules, they create rules. And that's the fundamental problem. And it's not only a problem to the media industry, it's a problem to the states, that these companies are taking over their roles. So it's a fundamental democratic problem. It's not only a problem for our industry.
We should note that Schibsted had spent a lot of thought and money into lobbying the system for regulation of these platforms companies, and we can see that you're eloquently arguing for this. And we are very near the end of this conversation. Maybe just the panelists could say one thing that you really, really want that should happen. One of these utopian or very practical media policy suggestions, if you have to choose. Carl-Gustaf, what would you suggest?
Yes, and I will promote the place where I'm sitting right now. I think collaboration in the media industry, both commercial and public service, is crucial, as well as collaboration with academia. And that's happening here at the Mediestudier Bergen, where I'm situated in Bergen in Norway. It's the sort of the cluster of the Norwegian media industry, and research is based here. And Leif Ove, who is in the audience, is the man behind this fantastic place. So that's something I really we'd like to see more of. This is also happening in Odense at the Syddanska Universitet.
Professor Victor Piccard, what's your one suggestion?
I'm struggling with it, but other than creating the Public Media Center, I just think trying to democratize these firms. You know, I agree with Raoul. I mean, this is a democratic problem, and we just can't leave all this power in the hands of Mark Zuckerberg or, you know, a couple of monopolies. So we must democratize. We need to find ways to do that. Easier said than done.
Indeed. Indeed. Ragnhild, I know this is a hopeless question, but still.
Okay, so if I am to stick with my main argument that subsidies should be to a larger extent channeled towards the individual media user, I think there's some media user groups that we really need to prioritize. And a group that we haven't talked about at all is immigrants, and particularly immigrants in terms of using local news. It's an area that is underdeveloped, and it's an area where we really need to work with integrating immigrants into the community by lowering the obstacle to using local news and information. So that would probably be my #1 priority, if I may, at this point.
And Raoul, your choice will close this seminar.
Yes, I will make 2 actually. The first one is, I'm coming back from what I said from the start, that even though we are talking a lot about problems and what the state should do and so on, we must not forget that this is a fantastic industry, with an extremely dynamic industry where you can make money, where you can make great products. And we as the media industry must focus on that and find the best people and be sure that those who love journalism are also good business people so that we can be competitive. And then just the last one, I think that the European Commission must keep up the good work. They are trying now, and they are trying to regulate, and that's a good start at least. So keep up the good work. It's I don't want just to complain. They are actually doing some good things.
So thank you very much, all you in the audience, and thanks to Raoul Grünthal, Carl-Gustaf Lindén, Victor Piccard, and Ragnhild Olsen. Thank you so much for your interesting contributions, and goodbye. That's the end of today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.